For 27 years, a man moved through the quiet suburbs of Northern California in total darkness, literally and figuratively. He didn't smash windows. He didn't leave notes. He didn't taunt police like the killers you've seen in other documentaries. He simply waited, outside a window, in a backyard, in the dark corner of a garage, and when the lights went out, he went to work. 9 confirmed victims, 6 cities, 15 years of attacks, 0 arrests. And then, one Thursday morning in September 2018, a mild-mannered, 58-year-old safety inspector walked into his job at UC Berkeley like he had every single day for the past 25 years, completely unaware that the last piece of a genetic puzzle, one he never knew existed, had just clicked into place 3,000 miles away. By the time he clocked in, it was already over. This is the story of the NorCal Rapist, and the tiny, invisible piece of evidence that no amount of planning could ever erase. Let's rewind. Not to the crimes, not yet. Let's rewind to the man. Because here's the first thing you need to understand about this case, and it's the thing that made it almost impossible to solve for nearly 3 decades. There was no obvious monster to look for. Roy Charles Waller was born on January 8, 1960. By the early 1990s, he was living an entirely unremarkable life in the Bay Area. He held a steady job. He would go on to work at the University of California, Berkeley for nearly 25 consecutive years, eventually rising to the position of environmental health and safety specialist. A job, ironically, built around protecting people from harm. He was married, he had a child. Neighbors in his hometown of Benicia would later describe him almost word for word, the same way neighbors always describe men like this after the arrest. Quiet, normal, kept to himself, cut his trees, pruned his hedges. One neighbor said that from a distance, he seemed completely normal, just a man tending to his yard. A former relative described him as happy-go-lucky, with a good attitude, maybe even funny. Sit with that for a second, because this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. This isn't a story about a drifter, a loner, or a man who fits some checklist of warning signs. This is a story about a man who built, deliberately or not, the single most effective disguise a predator can have: total, boring, forgettable normalcy. Psychologically, this matters. Serial offenders who sustain decades-long campaigns without detection typically share one trait above all others, what forensic psychologists call compartmentalization, the ability to wall off 2 completely separate identities in the same mind, so thoroughly that neither one contaminates the other. The husband who came home for dinner, the colleague who sat in safety briefings at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and the third man, the one nobody at that dinner table or in that office ever met, the one who studied neighborhoods, the one who watched, the one who waited for the lights to go out. We're going to spend the next 30 minutes with all 3 versions of this man. But right now, hold on to this image, the quiet man pruning his hedges, because by the end of this video, you will never be able to unsee what was actually standing behind it. The story detectives would eventually piece together begins in Rohnert Park, California, a small Sonoma County city about 50 miles north of San Francisco. In June of 1991, a man broke into a home and committed the first in what would become a string of violent crimes spanning nearly 3 decades. At the time, there was no task force, no nickname, no pattern, because a pattern requires more than one data point. And right now, there was just a terrified victim, a police report, and a suspect who had vanished into the night without a name. Here's what we know about his method, pieced together over years of investigation and later confirmed by detectives who worked the case for over a decade. He would break into women's homes at night, and once inside, in addition to the assaults, he would steal from the residents, sometimes forcing victims to accompany him to an ATM to withdraw cash. Think about what that detail tells us. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't a man losing control in a moment of rage, breaking into an occupied home at night, restraining a victim, and then calmly directing them to withdraw money. That requires planning. That requires a level head in the middle of committing a violent crime. It requires, frankly, a predator who had done his homework on the house, the neighborhood, and the person inside it before he ever crossed the threshold. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. No fingerprints worth pursuing, no witnesses who got a clear look, just a case file, and a community that for now had no idea what had just moved into their orbit. They wouldn't know it yet. But this was only attack number 1. Fast forward, different city, different year, same darkness. Over the next 15 years, attacks would occur across 6 different Northern California cities: Rohnert Park, Davis, Sacramento, and others scattered throughout the region. Detectives eventually connected at least 10 separate assaults to the same unknown assailant, though investigators always suspected the real number could be higher. The method became disturbingly consistent. He would force his way into a woman's home, tie her up, and blindfold her. But here's the detail that made even hardened investigators uneasy. The detail that separates this case from almost every other serial predator profile they'd worked. Often, after the assault, he would remain with the victim for hours, in what witnesses described as an almost intimate, unsettling manner. Let that detail land for a moment, because criminal psychologists will tell you it matters enormously. Most violent predators want to get in and get out, minimize their exposure, minimize the risk of getting caught. This man did the opposite. He lingered. He stayed in the most dangerous moment of his own crime far longer than necessary, in a home that wasn't his, with a victim who could, at any moment, fight back, scream, or be discovered. That is not the behavior of a man motivated purely by opportunity. That is the behavior of a man for whom the violation itself, the total control over another human being's fear, movement, and time, was the entire point. Forensic behavioral analysts have long noted that this kind of extended post-assault presence often signals a deeply rooted need for psychological domination, not simply physical gratification. It's a distinction that matters because it tells you exactly what kind of predator law enforcement was hunting: patient, controlled, and utterly indifferent to the terror he was prolonging. By the mid-2000s, police in multiple counties began to suspect they weren't looking at isolated incidents anymore. The methodology was too specific, too repeated to be coincidence. Somewhere out there, one man was responsible for a trail of terror that stretched across an entire region, and yet, from the outside, nobody had connected the dots publicly. Not yet. That was about to change. And when it did, this faceless predator would finally get the name that would haunt Northern California for the next decade: the NorCal Rapist. October 2006. North Natomas, a residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Sacramento. Quiet streets, family homes, the kind of place people move to specifically because nothing ever happens there. That illusion shattered one night when a man broke into a home shared by 2 women. He tied one of them up at gunpoint and raped her repeatedly. In the aftermath, one of the survivors sat down with police and provided a composite sketch, a face built from memory, trauma, and the desperate hope that somebody, somewhere, would recognize it. Every time he gets away with it, he will just become bolder and do more harm, she told a local news crew in the days after the attack, a warning that would prove chillingly accurate, though not in the way anyone expected. Just a few doors down the street, a man named James Dan had a home security camera. And that camera caught something. Grainy, imperfect, but real. Footage of an SUV, believed to belong to the suspect, parked in the neighborhood on the night of the attack. For a moment, it felt like a breakthrough. A sketch, a vehicle, physical evidence from the scene. Surely investigators thought this would be the case that finally gave them a name. It wasn't. The trail went cold. The sketch matched no one in any database. The vehicle led nowhere concrete. And the NorCal Rapist, a name now being used in briefings, in news reports, in the fearful conversations of parents locking their windows at night, simply disappeared. No more attacks would ever be definitively linked to him after that night in Natomas. For years, investigators didn't know if that meant he was dead, in prison for some unrelated crime, or if he had simply, chillingly, decided to stop. What they didn't know was that somewhere, in an evidence locker, sealed in paper envelopes and refrigerated storage, was the one thing he could never take back, disguise, or erase. His DNA, left behind at nearly every single crime scene for 15 years, waiting. It just needed the right technology to catch up to it. Here's something true crime documentaries don't always show you: the years in between. The unglamorous, grinding, often thankless work that happens after the headlines fade and the case goes cold in the public eye, but stays open on someone's desk. That someone was Sacramento police detective Avis Beery. Beery worked this case for 12 years. 12 years of reviewing the same file. 12 years of DNA that matched crime scene to crime scene, city to city, but matched no name in any criminal database. Because incredibly, despite committing at least 10 sexual assaults over 15 years, this man had never once been arrested for anything that would have put his DNA on file. Think about the sheer statistical improbability of that. A man commits assault after assault across 6 counties for a decade and a half, and yet, in all that time, he never gets pulled over for the wrong reason, never gets swabbed after some unrelated arrest, never so much as leaves a fingerprint the system already has on file. He wasn't lucky, he was careful, methodically, obsessively careful, in every part of his life except the one he could never fully control. The biological evidence his own body left behind every single time. For Detective Beery, that meant 12 years of hope deferred. 12 years of telling victims, women who had rebuilt their lives, who had moved, who had spent years trying to reclaim some sense of safety, that there was still no name, no arrest, no answers. "I've been waiting a really long time for this day to come," she would later say. "I never gave up hope that this day would come." But hope alone doesn't solve cold cases. Something else had to change. And in 2018, it finally did. Not because of a new witness, not because of a confession, but because of a quiet revolution happening in an entirely different field: consumer genealogy. To understand how the NorCal Rapist was finally caught, you have to understand what happened just a few months earlier, in April 2018, because it changed everything about how cold cases get solved in America. For decades, one of the most notorious unidentified serial offenders in California history had terrorized the state under the name the Golden State Killer. Like the NorCal Rapist, he had left DNA behind at his crime scenes. And like the NorCal Rapist, that DNA had sat in databases for years, matching nothing, because the man had never been arrested for anything serious enough to be swabbed. Then, investigators tried something new. Instead of searching a criminal database for an exact match, they uploaded the killer's crime scene DNA to a public genealogy website, a site regular people use to build family trees and find long-lost relatives. That website was GE Dead Match. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Even if the killer himself had never submitted his own DNA anywhere, there was a good chance that a distant cousin, a great-aunt, someone in his extended family tree, had, out of nothing more than curiosity about their ancestry. And if investigators could find that distant relative, they could work backward, branch by branch, through the family tree, until they arrived at exactly one person whose age, gender, and location matched the profile. In April 2018, that technique led directly to the arrest of former police officer Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, a case that had gone unsolved for over 40 years. It was, without exaggeration, one of the single greatest breakthroughs in the history of American forensic investigation, and Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert, whose office had helped crack it, immediately understood something crucial. This technique wasn't a one-time miracle, it was a new tool, and there was another unsolved case sitting right there on her desk, the NorCal Rapist. September 11, 2018. On this date, Sacramento investigators uploaded the NorCal Rapist's crime scene DNA profile to GIDmatch, the exact same site, using the exact same technique that had just brought down the Golden State Killer. And then they waited. This is the part of the story that should genuinely give you chills, because of how fast it happened after 27 years of nothing. Within hours, not weeks, not months, hours, the search returned a close genetic relative. Somewhere in that family tree was their answer. Genetic genealogists began the painstaking work of building it out. Parents, siblings, cousins, working through public records, obituaries, marriage records, anything that could narrow an entire branch of a family tree down to one specific man, of one specific age, who would have been physically capable of committing crimes going back to 1991. The investigation narrowed, methodically, until one name emerged: Roy Charles Waller. Now, here's where police had to be extraordinarily careful. A genealogical lead is not proof. It's a direction, not a destination. You cannot arrest a man, especially not for crimes this serious, based on a family tree alone. Investigators needed his actual DNA, obtained legally, matched directly against the crime scene samples. So they did what cold case units have done for decades when they need a DNA sample without tipping off a suspect: covert surveillance. Somewhere, quietly, detectives began watching Roy Waller, an ordinary man, at this point completely unaware that 27 years of silence was about to end, waiting for their opportunity. A discarded cup, a cigarette butt, something he touched and threw away without a second thought, never imagining it would be the single most important piece of trash he ever produced. The DNA came back as a match to the 1991 attack in Rohnert Park, a match to Davis, a match to Sacramento, a match to Natomas. 27 years, spread across 9 victims and 6 cities, and it all led back to one man's genetic code, sitting quietly, right there in the DNA the entire time. September 20th, 2018, an ordinary Thursday morning. Roy Charles Waller, 58 years old, arrived for work at the University of California, Berkeley, just as he had for nearly 25 years. Officers, positioned and waiting, moved in. The arrest was carried out amid the ordinary bustle of a university campus, quietly, without incident. No standoff, no chase, no dramatic confrontation. Just a man being placed in handcuffs in a parking lot he had walked through thousands of times before, while students and colleagues who had known him for decades looked on, utterly unaware of who they'd actually been standing next to. He was charged initially with 12 counts of forcible sexual assault and held without bail. The reaction from people who knew him was, almost universally, disbelief. His former brother-in-law described him as happy-go-lucky, with a good attitude, someone he never would have suspected. the University of California released a statement noting they were reviewing all sexual assault cases connected to the campus to determine whether Waller might be linked to others. And back in Sacramento, District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert stood in front of a room full of cameras and delivered the line that would define this case for years to come. The answer has always been in the DNA. It's a simple sentence, but sit with what it actually means. For 27 years, the truth about who this man was had been sitting, dormant, in evidence lockers across 6 counties, completely unreachable, not because investigators weren't looking, but because the technology to read it simply didn't exist yet. Roy Waller wasn't caught because he made a mistake in 2018. He was caught because science finally caught up to a mistake he'd been making since 1991. The simple, unavoidable biological fact that he could never leave a crime scene without leaving a piece of himself behind. "Today is the beginning of justice," said one city council member, speaking on behalf of a community that had lived in fear for over a decade. And for 2 women who had lived in that North Natomas neighborhood, women who had since moved away just to escape the memory of what happened there, the arrest brought something they hadn't felt in years: relief. But an arrest isn't a conviction, and investigators quickly discovered something that made this case even more disturbing than they'd initially realized. As investigators dug deeper into Waller's life, searching properties connected to him, they found something that erased any lingering doubt about who they were dealing with. Inside a storage unit belonging to Waller, police discovered handcuffs, zip ties, a ski mask, and duct tape. Take a moment to actually process what that means. This wasn't random household clutter. This was a kit. A curated collection of restraint and concealment tools, kept together, maintained, in a private space separate from his home and family, the kind of space a man keeps specifically so that no one in his actual life will ever stumble across it by accident. This detail matters enormously from a psychological standpoint because it directly contradicts any narrative of impulsivity. Predators who offend in moments of rage or opportunity don't maintain dedicated equipment caches over decades. What investigators found in that storage unit was evidence of premeditation as a lifestyle, not a series of isolated bad nights, but an ongoing, deliberately maintained double identity that Waller had been actively curating since at least the early 1990s. It's the physical proof of everything we discussed back in Part 1. The compartmentalization wasn't just psychological, it was architectural. He had built himself a literal, physical space to store the second identity, separate from the house where his wife and child slept, separate from the office where his university colleagues saw him every day. For 25 years, that second identity had a home, and nobody ever knew it was there, until now. The case went to trial in the fall of 2020, more than 2 years after Waller's arrest. The sheer volume of evidence, spanning multiple counties and decades, made this an enormously complex prosecution to build. Ultimately, Waller stood trial for 46 counts related to the rapes of 9 women across 6 Northern California cities between 1991 and 2006. His defense attorney, Joseph Farina, faced what may be one of the most difficult positions any defense lawyer can be handed. A case where the central evidence isn't a witness who can be cross-examined, isn't a confession that can be challenged as coerced. It's a molecular match, repeated across 9 separate crime scenes, over 15 years. "It didn't matter what I did," Farina later admitted. "It was a DNA case. We could not overcome the fact that his DNA was at nearly all the crime scenes." And here's a detail that says something profound about the psychology of a man who had spent decades getting away with it. According to his own attorney, Waller never seemed to fully accept the weight of the evidence against him. He believed, right up until the moment of the verdict, that he would be acquitted. He denied any involvement. Think about what that level of denial actually represents. This is a man confronted with DNA evidence from 9 separate crime scenes spanning nearly 3 decades, a statistical impossibility of coincidence, and he genuinely could not or would not accept the outcome. Forensic psychologists describe this pattern as a hallmark of deeply entrenched denial systems, often built up over so many years of successful concealment that the offender begins to internalize their own untouchability as fact, rather than luck. For 27 years, Roy Waller had been right, every single time, that he would get away with it. His mind, it seems, simply never adjusted to the idea that the streak could end. On November 18, 2020, Waller was found guilty on all 46 counts. A month later, on December 18, 2020, Roy Charles Waller stood before a Sacramento County Superior Court judge for sentencing. He received 897 years to life in prison. There is no version of a human lifespan that survives a sentence like that. It is, functionally, a number designed not for the calendar, but for the record. A way for the court to say, in the clearest possible terms, that every single one of his 9 victims mattered, that every single charge would be accounted for individually, and that there would be no ambiguity, no possibility of parole, no scenario in which Roy Waller ever walks free again. Yolo County District Attorney Jeff Reisig thanked the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office for bringing what he called a violent predator to justice, praising their innovative work on behalf of the community. For Detective Avis Beery, the investigator who had carried this case for over 12 years, through every dead end, every cold trail, every year without an answer, the sentencing wasn't just the end of a prosecution. It was the closing of a chapter she had personally kept open through sheer refusal to let it die. So let's step back now and ask the question this entire case forces us to confront. How does a man do this for 27 years? Not how does he get away with it? We've answered that. DNA technology simply hadn't caught up yet. The real question is psychological. How does someone maintain 2 completely separate lives, one of them built on decades of premeditated violence, without a single person in his orbit? His wife, his child, 25 years of university colleagues, ever suspecting? The uncomfortable answer, according to decades of research into serial predators who evade capture for extended periods, is that the skills required to be a devoted employee and the skills required to sustain a hidden pattern of predation are not actually in conflict. They can, disturbingly, reinforce each other. Discipline, routine, an unremarkable public presentation. The very traits that made Waller a reliable 25-year employee at one of the most respected institutions in the country are, functionally, the exact same traits that allowed him to plan, execute, and conceal violent crimes across 6 counties without detection. This is what makes cases like this one so much more disturbing than the ones involving an obvious loner or a man with a visible criminal history. There was no gap in his resume to investigate, no pattern of minor offenses escalating over time, no neighbors who called the police about strange behavior. The entire warning system society typically relies on: visible red flags, community intuition, prior record, failed completely for 27 years because Waller never gave anyone a reason to look. The only thing that never lied, the only piece of evidence that couldn't be talked around, charmed, or compartmentalized away, was his own DNA. What happened to the women whose lives intersected with Roy Waller in the worst possible way doesn't end with a sentencing hearing. For the 9 confirmed victims, and possibly others whose cases were never definitively linked, the 27 years between the first attack and the final verdict represent something almost impossible to fully articulate. An entire generation of not knowing. Some moved away from the neighborhoods where they were attacked, like the two women from North Natomas, rebuilding entire lives elsewhere just to create distance from what happened. Others stayed, carrying the knowledge quietly, waiting through detective changes, waiting through years of silence from a case that, from the outside, appeared to have gone cold and stayed cold. 9 victims waited over 2 decades for a suspect to be found. Read that sentence again. 2 decades, not months, not years, decades, spent not knowing if the man who broke into their home was still out there, still watching other neighborhoods, still capable of walking past them on the street without either of them ever knowing. The case also permanently changed how law enforcement across the country approaches cold cases involving unidentified DNA. What worked for the Golden State Killer and then for the NorCal Rapist just 5 months later proved this wasn't a one-time fluke. It was a repeatable methodology. In the years since, investigative genetic genealogy has been used to crack cold cases that had sat unsolved for 30, 40, even 50 years, giving victims and families across the country a form of closure that, for decades, simply didn't exist as a possibility. Roy Waller's case became, in a strange and unintended way, part of the proof of concept, a second data point demonstrating that no matter how careful a predator believes himself to be, no matter how long he manages to hide inside an ordinary life, the biological evidence he leaves behind is permanent. It doesn't fade with time. It doesn't forget. It simply waits, for as long as it takes, for the technology and the people who refuse to give up to finally catch up to it. Here's what stays with you after a case like this one. It's not the number of years. It's not even the 897 attached to his sentence. It's the hedges. The quiet man pruning his hedges. The reliable co-worker of 25 years. The husband, the father, the safety specialist who spent his professional life ensuring other people's protection, while for nearly 3 decades he was the single greatest threat several communities never knew they were living beside. Roy Waller is not a monster who looked like a monster. He's proof of something far more unsettling, that the people we build our sense of safety around, the quiet, unremarkable, forgettable people who blend so completely into the background of our lives that we never think to question them, are exactly the ones capable of carrying something like this, undetected, for 27 years. The case was solved. Justice, eventually, was served. But the question it leaves behind is one that doesn't come with a comfortable answer. How many other ordinary-looking lives, right now, in ordinary-looking neighborhoods, are hiding something no one has thought to look for yet? The DNA is always the last thing to lie. The only question left is who's still waiting for someone to check. If this case disturbed you the way it disturbed me putting it together, that's exactly the reaction it should get. Cases like this only get solved because people refuse to look away. Detectives who won't close the file, and audiences who keep these stories alive long after the news cycle moves on. If you want more deep-dive investigations like this one, cases where the real story isn't just what happened, but why it took so long to see it, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're covering another case just like it very soon. And before you go, drop a comment below. Tell me what part of this case unsettled you the most. Was it the storage unit? The 12 years Detective Beery refused to give up? Or the fact that nobody around him ever suspected a thing? I read every single comment, and honestly, this is the part of the process that keeps this channel going, hearing what actually lands with you. If this video kept you watching till the very end, do me one favor. Share it with someone who loves true crime as much as you do. It genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think. Stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next one.